less range, just
Okay.
still the same.
So what was your question?
Well, you were talking about how up top things are more likely to drive things below.
Okay, so let's be very, very clear when you say a blanket statement like that.
The closing of the posterior aspect of the rib cage and a more exhaled position of the spine is more likely to drive an anteriorly, externally, no.
It's an anteriorly orientation. It's an
anterior-
anterior orientation of the pelvis. So you have changes, the relative changes within the pelvis, but when the whole pelvis moves as a unit, then that's not relative motion within the pelvis.
Okay.
So if you have an anterior orientation, it's going to be above the pelvis, typically driving that.
So would you say that that was the case for the patient we just saw?
Without question.
Yeah.
Without question.
So then,
So if you look at his dorsal rostral thorax and you saw how close together his scaps are,
Yeah.
and you see the scapular elevation driving his head forward and
Mhm.
pushing his sternum down,
yeah.
right? And so then I have all of these compensatory strategies going on, and that's what's driving the orientation of the pelvis.
Right.
Because
So-
it's not a within change. So it's not like a relative inhalation exhalation position. It is an anterior orientation that's
So-
driving that show.
Can I make an assumption on why you were utilizing a 90-90 position and accessory muscles below, as opposed to utilizing more of like a quadruped position that's going to specifically target that area, where you just
Yeah, you can try.
where you
Go
just
ahead.
utilizing those muscles to assist because you knew that he was going to need more assistance in order to open that area back up, or was there another reason as to why you were
Okay,
going after that position?
So now let's talk about what is concentrically oriented on the posterior side of the rib cage.
Okay.
So we talked about that a little bit yesterday.
Muscles, you mean?
Well, if you want to talk muscles, we can do that, but
Just areas.
let's just go area first, and then we can make a reference to something that I showed you a picture of
Sure.
that will be an influence here.
Okay.
Okay. So if I compress the posterior rib cage
Mm-hmm.
and I shove it forward,
Mm-hmm.
right? What is concentrically oriented? And go ahead and just give me like just a general description of musculature that would compress that posterior area.
Rhomboids,
Keep going.
traps,
Keep going.
upper traps,
Go deeper.
serratus posterior.
Keep going.
Deeper.
Yep.
Intercostals.
Not quite that deep.
Okay.
Something spine-ish.
Oh, like longissimus.
Yeah.
Like
So we start talking
pectoralis.
about spinal erectors and things
Okay.
like that, right? So where do they attach? Remember the picture?
Yes. So they'll go into like that little spaghetti tendon that you were showing me.
Right. And where do they end up attaching?
Top of the sacrum.
Oh, okay. So now I have this direct connection to the pelvis from the thorax that I have to appreciate, right? And so if I have this compressed strategy and I have a concentric orientation of those thoracic erectors,
Mm-hmm.
and I have the orientation of the pelvis, well, how do I get the pelvis to tip back as I'm elongating, right?
Utilize muscles that are going to.
Correct. So what I need to do is I need to go again. I need something that directly opposes that, so I can create an eccentric orientation on the posterior aspect of the body. Could I have gone quadruped? Yes, but he's also a wide ISA.
Okay.
So the problem with the wide ISA is he's going to bend halfway through his thoracic spine. It's going to look like the roof of a house.
Crunch.
Yeah. So he's going to try to drive a rectus abdominis and pull his sternum down because the orientation has already driven his sternum down.
Right.
So he's going to immediately try to recruit.
pushing him more into the strategy that he's
Exactly right. And so that's why I didn't want to go quadruped. So we do something with an overhead reach so that when he does exhale, he's not going to pull his sternum down. The sternum's going to get pulled up by the overhead reach.
Okay.
You see why we went that way?
Yeah.
Because the first thing I have to do is I have to get a dynamic ISA.
Right.
Because if I don't have that lower rib cage able to overcome his compensatory strategy, I have nothing anyway.
So two things. If you had someone who's narrow, then you'd be more likely to go into quadruped.
Yes.
Because they were less likely to go into that down
Correct.
pump handle.
Correct.
And then if he had less layers of compensation and less of a, not so much of a down pump handle position, like your traditional wide ISA might have, then are you also more likely to go into quadruped?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. There's very few absolutes, but there's some elements that I think that you have to respect in regards to your sequences.
Sure.
And so it's just you literally could take your wide ISAs and you can put them in quadruped. Sometimes it works, but a lot of times it doesn't, especially when I have the compressed concentric strategy posterior, because what position am I putting him in all fours?
What position are you putting him in?
Yeah, the relative position of the shoulder girdle relative to his body.
Be like a 90 degree.
Yeah, and that's not the place that I want to go if I'm trying to eccentrically orient that posterior aspect.
Well, so now, and
That's why we kept his arms below shoulder level when he was doing his standing activity,
Correct.
and that's why we went above shoulder level with his supine activity, because I got to keep him in a position where I know I can drive the inhalation much more effectively than the exhalation.
But so then we had the first guy that came in, appeared as if he was a wide because of layers of compensation.
Yep.
But he probably started out as a narrow in space-time or whatever. So that's why you're more likely to put him into that quadruped position to start out with.
Yes.
And even though it did look crunchy to me, because he had that like massive divot, that divot, that it's almost like that's where the crunch is where his spine should have been, and then the layers of compensation was almost like the indentation of like where he compensated to put his spine essentially. or
Yeah,
his
but
sternum.
but again, so when we inverted him,
Yeah.
look where his shoulder, this relative position of his
Yeah.
shoulder
Okay.
was in the inhaled position.
But so he was also commenting that without the inversion, it was almost more comfortable. But you don't think he was acquiring the spinal position?
I don't think it was
below
even
that?
close. I don't think it was even close.
Okay.
Because I think he was too again, we have to make sure that we're moving the shoulder girdle into a relative position of inhalation. And again, that's why the inversion is so powerful, is because we invert the airflow and we put the shoulder girdle in an inhaled position.
So you just bias it.
Yep, and again, and that's the best way to put it, is it's just a bias, it's not an absolute. It's like there's elements of both that are always occurring, it's just like which one is the predominant.
It was still working a little bit for him when he was at 90 degrees.
Yeah, I think he probably got some comfort out of it, but and again, but we can't be satisfied with just a little bit of change, right? And you saw the big change, last patient yesterday,
Freshman.
the doctor,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
you start banging your head against the wall and you go, what am I gonna do, what am I gonna do, what am I gonna do? And then you go, oh, it's a top-down driven thing.
Right.
And then immediately you see the big, like 40-degree change in motion, and then he's telling you that, oh, this feels so much better.
And we even still got changes below, even though we were doing like a less capable drill with him.
Right.
But then as soon as we married the two, we got not exactly what we wanted, but much more.
Oh, yeah.
than
Oh,
before.
yeah. Does that help you?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Okay.
All right, so to synthesize, if you have a wide infrasternal angle individual
Mhm.
Who has layers of compensation, you are more likely to utilize like a 90-90 position because it's less likely to put them in those compensated positions, essentially.
Right. Okay. So let's make a generalized statement, as much as I dislike them.
Sure.
When you're looking at people that have layers of superficial strategy You have to work outside in.
Okay.
I have to eliminate the superficial strategy first, because if I don't, they're still going to be compressed. So I did nothing. And there's multiple ways to get there. So I'm not absolute in what my choice of activity is going to be, or position that it's going to be. But in general, it's the easiest place to be, because I'm eliminating gravity. And I'm making it easier for him to achieve a position that he doesn't naturally approximate, right? He doesn't know how to overcome the compensatory strategy. And so I have to make everything easy for him. So I limit it to how much muscle activity that we're going to use. I limit him to a very specific reaching pattern. So he's only got to think about 3 things. Because when you're looking at the system as a whole, and knowing that I have so many influences, the fewer of those influences that I can narrow the activity to, the more successful he's going to be immediately. And that's why I say, it's like, okay, first things first. What do you got to do? I got to overcome the compensatory strategy. So he's got 2 that are glaring, right?
Those
One
are
is the
top
compensatory.
layers.
One's the compensatory inhalation strategy,
Right.
and then the other one is the upper
Sternum position.
it's the upper compressive strategy there. It's like, okay, so is there a way I can kill 2 birds with 1 stone? Absolutely. And I give him something simple, right? But the way we set him up, it made it easy, because I put his head in a certain position to keep dorsal rostral open. I put his pelvis in a certain position to make sure that I was eccentrically orienting what was concentrically oriented. And then I had to give him an active strategy to make sure that he was able to overcome the inhalation strategy and not pull the sternum down at the same time with the reach. So again, it's like, where can I make the biggest impact with the fewest required cues? Which you kind of learned yesterday when you went through the one exercise.
Sure.
Where you gave him like 17 cues, and I understand why you do that, but so think about where we put Terry. Much easier, get your booty in a certain position, reach in this direction, and just make sure you exhale. 3 things, solid.
That first drill, 90-90 with bilateral overhead reach, cued arms towards ceiling for the exhale, just to
On the first exhale.
Yes, just
Yes,
to
absolutely.
exaggerate the exhale position that you want him to acquire.
Right. Makes it a little bit easier to set up the exercise.
Refresh my memory. Did you have him hold that exhale and then move his arms up on the first inhale? Okay, and that was just to dry pump him.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
One of the sensations that Terry doesn't have is the ability to know where his scapula are in space.
Why is that?
Well, because he's trained himself into a position that he walks
Sure.
around with all day long, right? So he doesn't know what it feels like to actually, his scapula want to be buddies,
Mhm.
and they should never kiss, right? There should always be muscle and space in between that's created by the internal expansion, which he doesn't have. So he's literally compressed that area closed.
Right.
And so he really doesn't know what it feels like to have that area eccentrically oriented, fill up with space. And so that first reach literally allows him to feel what the dorsal rostral feels like on the table, and then he knows where his scapula are.
So
it's a setup. It's not like the most important part of the exercise, other than to position the scapula so he knows where he is.
and that's also why we're putting our hands on their back and
1000%.
feel that.
People don't. So when somebody can't create the sensation themselves, that's what manual therapy is for.
Right.
We have to create the sensation for them. Granted, at some level, biochemically there could be a change, neurophysiologically there can be a change, but ultimately there's a sensory input that becomes valuable. So placing your hand and creating an awareness that they do not have. Most people don't know what their back feels like.
So in that broad of a term of manual therapy, like a tactile cue.
1000%.
is manual therapy.
You're touching, right? Yeah, absolutely. Do you think they feel something? Absolutely they do. If I compress your rib cage, do you think you're feeling something? Absolutely. So there's always a sensory input associated with it. And again, if somebody can create that sensory input themselves, if somebody can effectively move their rib cage into the exhale position, I don't have to do anything. It doesn't help when I do it,
Because they can already feel it.
because they don't learn as much. But if I have to create sort of this internal vocabulary of what things feel like for them, because they don't have it themselves. So that's why you give an internal cue versus an external cue at times, because if they don't have any way to formulate a sensation, right? If I've been blind my entire life and you give me sight, people think that they see the same thing that we do, and they do not, right? They don't even know what it's overwhelming to people. Right, there's no frame of reference. And so if I have been using a strategy for a long enough period of time, I have given up the sensation of the opposing strategy. And so it's folly for us to believe that we can simply give somebody a cue and they immediately recapture it.
Sure.
Right? Now some athletes can do that because they're wired differently, but when we talk about somebody like a Terry that comes in and he has worked so diligently to achieve something in the absolute wrong direction,
Right.
he's given up a lot. And so we got to teach him. That's where we spent so much time working on his rib cage, because he just doesn't even know where exhalation is anymore.
But even though he didn't have a coach helping him to, I guess, articulate the sensations that he was acquiring on his own with like the I's, the Y's, and the T's, you think he was still able to capture that?
Like a sensation?
I mean, just like
Eventually,
of,
yeah.
of like creating that internal language.
He did, but okay, but just think about how magnified it was in one direction. So he's all by himself. He's executing these exercises to the best of his ability, and he is diligent. Trust me, he is diligent with everything you give him. And then, so his perception of what is correct is what he was chasing.
Right.
And so once he felt something, his assumption was, I need to feel that again and again and again and again. And then, again, depending on what you read and what people tell you that's appropriate, then he tries to hold himself there. And so then he gives himself perpetual cues all day long.
But so I guess because a better question towards that is like, since he did, we're a coach and we're giving him a frame of reference of like what is right and wrong, sensation-wise. But he didn't have that reference necessarily because it was guiding himself, right?
Right.
I guess, what is it that made him feel like, okay, that's right,
Because he felt something.
but he just perceived that as the right thing to feel?
Right, because he didn't have any other frame of reference. So as soon as he felt something strong enough that matched
So-
what he perceived as correct. So whatever he read or whatever he viewed that drove him into the exercise-related strategies that he was using.
And then there was a magnitude of sensation.
Right, so he feels something, and then he makes the association, and that's how you learn, right? So he has an analogy in his head of what it should be. He feels something, he makes that association, and there's his correct. Correct or not, that was his perception of what's correct. And so then that's what drives every other element of his approach, right? Because that's the sensation. And so he kept driving the same sensation over and over and over again. What we have to do for him now is do the opposing. We give him the appropriate sensation. We give him the appropriate strategy. We give him the appropriate cues. And now he has to literally unlearn what he did before and relearn what we're trying to provide.
So then how about when people are learning these layers of compensation? Because it's not like someone is reading on the internet like, oh, I need to compress my sternum in order to exhale, you know? So it's like, and these all seem like very unconscious
Absolutely.
actions.
Absolutely.
So it's like you're not conscious of like the magnitude of,
Correct.
okay, I learned
Correct.
how to exhale now.
Right.
So in that instance, what is it that's driving the learning?
Right, okay, so now we're talking about complex adaptive systems, which is what humans are, okay? And so within the system, there are constraints. So that's your physical structure, your physiology, your anything that underlies that, right? And so there's a limit as to what strategies are possible within that system.
Okay.
Now, within complex systems, all the properties of that system are emergent, so they don't require a top-down. So everybody thinks that the brain rules everything, and it doesn't. Like literally, your cells make all their own stuff. The cells communicate with each other without the influence of the brain. Even when you're running across the ground, your movement system is doing things that have nothing to do with the brain.
Right.
So all of the strategies that we see that are somewhat predictive in regards to what's possible are merely the system working within its constraints, within a context. And so that's why we can say that there are certain strategies that are more apparent. And then we talk about layers of strategy, because there's only so many ways that you're built, right? And so everybody's kind of built the same way, so eventually they're going to fall back on their strategy. But these are all emergent. So it's all I have to use. So I'm just going to keep using it as long as it's successful. So like things that are unsuccessful, you don't do. But we don't get to define what is successful. Your physiology does. And so let's just make a leap, and let's just say, okay, let's just say the brain does rule for a second.
Sure.
So the brain is very oxygen hungry.
Sure.
It likes air. So it's 2% of your body weight consumes 20% of your oxygen. So it doesn't care what you do. It doesn't care if you hurt. It doesn't care if your movement is limited. It only cares if it gets air. And so it says, I'm going to take the constraints of this system and I'm going to manipulate them under this context to allow me to assure that I get sufficient airflow to keep me alive, because that's all it cares about. It's like, I want to stay alive and I want to make another one of me.
So within complex systems that utilize emergence to
All
create
complex systems will
strategies.
use emergent properties.
Right. But it's the constraint within this complex system, human. It's a physiologic constraint that's then determining what's successful and what's not successful.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. But so think about this though. So under certain circumstances, the strategy may fulfill a specific need. So I do get my oxygen from my brain, but I also create an anxious person. How about that?
Right. There's
Or I create depression. Right? All of these byproducts that people experience can be elements of something else. But it's successful enough that it continues to use a strategy.
there's unforeseen consequences.
There's always secondary consequences to every strategy that you use. And the system probably has I don't know if you could say that it knows this, but it just doesn't care, because it's trying to fulfill specific absolute needs of stay alive.